Beneath the velvet tapestry of history, some periods shimmer not with glory, but with a tragic, feverish unease. We turn our gaze now to a night darkened Paris, a time when the very soul of a nation seemed to unravel. When did the radiant passion for liberty decay into the cold hysteria of the guillotine? This is not a tale of monarchs and armies, but of the human mind under impossible pressure, the terror, the desperate righteousness, and the frantic need to find meaning in the chaos of change. The echoes of a collective breakdown still whisper lessons about our own fragile certainties. Tonight, as we drift into the calm, let us explore the psychological anatomy of a nation that lost its footing, and what they desperately sought to build in its place. Let the distance of history offer you a shield, transforming the frightening noise of chaos into a quiet, structured understanding of the deep human drive for order. The void of absolute monarchy. To understand the madness that came, we must first understand the profound psychological stillness that preceded it. For centuries, France operated under the comforting, terrible simplicity of the Ancien Regime. The king was God's representative, the social order was sacred, and your place in the world was immutable. This system, however unjust, provided an absolute anchor for the collective psyche. It meant that the great existential questions of who am I and what is my purpose were largely answered for you before birth. Your destiny was fixed within a divine hierarchy, leaving little room for individual thought or ambition beyond the pre-approved social channels. This stability came at a steep cost, the profound suppression of individual agency. Every person carried a silent, pent-up psychological burden, the weight of knowing that their potential, their fate, and their very existence were subject to a singular, external will they could neither question nor influence. This pressure cooker of unspoken frustration and suppressed desires created a dangerous, volatile energy beneath the surface of French society. This energy was waiting only for a structural fault, a moment to release its accumulated stress and anxiety into the world in an explosive, unpredictable rush. The system was stable only insofar as its divine justification remained unquestioned, and the moment philosophical scrutiny began, its psychological foundation trembled. That moment arrived when the monarchy, the very bedrock of all their psychological certainty, cracked. The king's authority did not just weaken, it created a catastrophic existential void. The source of all truth, law, and moral order, the figure who mediated God's will, vanished. Suddenly, millions of minds were left without an organizing principle, staring into the abyss of absolute freedom. This absence is not liberating. It is deeply, fundamentally terrifying. It triggers a frantic collective human response, the desperate need to find a replacement, anchor that is equally absolute. The sudden shift from total order to total disorder was too much for the collective psyche to process safely. The psychological panic wasn't caused by the Bastille falling. It was caused by the source of all authority being proven mortal. The people realized they were responsible for everything, themselves, their neighbors, and the state, with no divine guide to arbitrate. This sudden, unwanted anxiety of new freedom was crippling. They needed something, anything, to fill that moral and existential vacuum. They sought an answer that was as rigid and as unquestionable as the God-given monarchy they had just shattered. This psychological dependency on an external absolute is a hallmark of societies transitioning violently from rigid hierarchies to self-governance. In this state of terror, the human mind craves simplicity. It rejects complexity and ambiguity. It demands a new, unquestionable certainty to replace the old one. The revolution was thus born from this frantic desire for absolute immediate meaning, giving rise to concepts of virtue and the people's will as new, infallible deities. This internal psychological demand for a new absolute system is what paved the inevitable, blood-soaked road for the reign of terror. The birth of collective effervescence. The immediate aftermath of the initial revolts was marked by an astonishing, pervasive euphoria. This was the moment of the Fête de la Fédération, where the entire nation, symbolised by representatives from every region, gathered in a massive, ecstatic celebration of unity. Psychologically, this phenomenon is known as collective effervescence, a concept coined by sociologist Émile Durkheim. It describes a state where a large group shares intense, synchronized emotions that transcend individual feelings, creating a powerful shared sense of communion, power, and sacred meaning. It is the spontaneous, powerful creation of a temporary shared spiritual identity. In this highly charged collective state, individual doubt is utterly suppressed. The group mind believes itself to be omnipotent, morally pure and infallible. Every face reflects the same joyous conviction, reinforcing the belief that the people, the new sovereign, can achieve anything and are incapable of moral error. It's a heady, addictive feeling, a temporary emotional drug that instantly relieves the existential anxiety of freedom experienced in the previous vacuum. For a brief, intoxicating moment, all historical and personal differences vanish under the banner of a perfect shared identity, giving a sense of invulnerability and sacred purpose. This mass emotional high provided the first unstable replacement for the monarchy, the cult of unity. People didn't just love the abstract ideals of the revolution, they loved the feeling of being part of this perfect, singular moral body. However, as is true with any highly intense emotional state, it is profoundly unstable and requires constant, overwhelming stimulation to be sustained. The moment internal disagreements began to surface, this cherished, perfect unity was immediately threatened, plunging the participants back toward the anxiety they desperately tried to escape. Any return to political complexity was felt as a personal, existential betrayal of the collective feeling. Any threat to the collective feeling of oneness was perceived not as a mere political disagreement, but as an existential threat to the new moral anchor. The psychological security derived from this unity was so profound, so deeply restorative after centuries of suppression, that anyone who challenged it was not merely an opponent, but a corrosive element, a disease, a pollution that had to be ruthlessly expelled for the good and purity of the whole. This sets the psychological stage for the unforgiving nature of the factional fights to come. The sheer scale of their shared joy made the fear of its loss equally vast and destabilizing. The citizens had momentarily found their missing moral centre in one another, in the ecstatic belief in themselves. But this bond was brittle. The craving to maintain the exhilarating purity of that original perfect unity would soon turn into a ruthless pathological obsession, where the elimination of difference became the highest form of patriotism and self-preservation. Cognitive dissonance and the traitor. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was a monumental psychological act. It codified the belief in universal human dignity and absolute equality, painting a portrait of an ideal reality. But this sacred text immediately created a profound case of cognitive dissonance, the psychological stress we feel when holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. The two primary contradictory beliefs were, all men are created equal in rights and liberty, and I am still starving, cold, and living in squalor while chaos reigns. The revolution had proclaimed a glorious, rational, and free reality, yet the lived, sensory reality remained one of endemic poverty, fear, war, and scarcity. The human mind cannot tolerate this gap indefinitely. The stress is too great. It must resolve the dissonance. It had two primary, painful options. Either conclude that the declaration is wrong, which would mean the entire revolution was a meaningless bloody trauma and their participation was futile, or conclude that something external is actively blocking the truth of the declaration from manifesting. The collective mind overwhelmingly chose the second path, as it preserved the psychological investment they had already made in the revolution. The declaration must be true. Therefore, the reason the ideal world hadn't arrived yet was not a matter of economic difficulty, complex political logistics, or war, but a matter of malicious sabotage. There had to be an invisible, malevolent force actively holding the perfect republic back, a hidden hand poisoning the well. This intellectual choice was the psychological genesis of the pervasive paranoia. The greater the suffering, the worse the famine, the more severe the military defeats, the stronger the dissonance, and thus the more radical and violent the required solution became. Every empty marketplace, every setback, every minor political disagreement was instantly interpreted not as proof of difficulty, but as irrefutable proof of treason. The traitor became the necessary psychological construct used to bridge the unlivable gap between their sublime idealism and their wretched, disappointing reality, externalizing all failure. To eliminate this overwhelming psychological stress, the traitors had to be eliminated. This made the act of denunciation and execution feel, paradoxically, like a moral necessity, not a political purge, but an act of cognitive resolution. They weren't just killing people, they were performing a sacred duty to align their world back with the sacred text of the Declaration, resolving their own unbearable internal conflict. The quest for meaning and absolute clarity demanded bloodshed as a means of self-soothing the collective mind. The anxiety of transferred agency. Under the king, the moral and legal heavy lifting was done for you. The crushing weight of ethical and political choice rested squarely on the king's shoulders. The people were simply cogs in a predefined machine. When the king vanished, the entire terrifying weight of responsibility, agency, shifted instantly to the average citizen. They were now expected to make complex moral and political decisions instantly, in a chaotic, war-torn environment, with zero training or preparation for self-governance. The psychological landscape changed overnight from one of obedience to one of impossible, demanding freedom. The psychological shock of this immense sudden transfer of power was profound. It created a deep, paralyzing anxiety of agency. They had demanded power, but now that they had it, the responsibility felt utterly unbearable. This shock led to a desperate, almost childlike yearning for a strong, singular hand to guide them again. They sought to transfer this unbearable personal responsibility onto a new, pure entity, the general will as articulated by the leading political clubs, particularly the highly centralized Jacobin leadership. The individual citizen's response to this anxiety was often to become hypervigilant and fiercely rigid in their newfound ideological convictions. To admit uncertainty, to express complexity, or to tolerate ambiguity was perceived as inviting the terrifying chaos back into the void. Therefore, any perceived failure, military, political or moral, could not be blamed on inherent difficulty or human error. It had to be blamed on a lack of purity or sufficient ruthlessness in pursuing the ideal. The stakes of being wrong were suddenly too high for critical thought. This is why the political clubs and societies, particularly the Jacobins, thrived. They offered a structure, a clearly defined, simple ideology, and a communal space to practice the new, terrifying role of the citizen. By adhering strictly to the party line, the individual could relinquish personal moral responsibility back to the collective trading individual, agonizing anxiety for a collective, rigid and simple certainty. This provided a crucial, temporary relief from the burden of self-determination. The purity of the cause became the new king, an unyielding, abstract authority. The individual mind, burdened by the crushing weight of making history and making life or death decisions, gladly surrendered its nuance and complexity to the simple, violent dictates of the collective. This psychological relief of trading agonizing choice for simple, violent instruction proved irresistible, paving the way for the terror to be embraced and sustained by the very masses it endangered. The concretization of threat, human nature, abhors a vague threat. The psychological distress caused by abstract, complex problems, like the sudden collapse of the national economy, or the overwhelming threat of foreign invasion across all borders, is overwhelming precisely because there is no single, visible target to fight. The mind, in its defence, will subconsciously work to concretize the threat. It will invent an enemy that can be seen, denounced, and demonstrably defeated, offering a false sense of control. In the French Revolution, the problem was correctly identified as a lack of virtue and an abundance of chaos, but virtue is intangible, and chaos is everywhere. The psychological solution was the invention of the traitor, who was suddenly revealed to be everywhere, hiding in plain sight. This shift was a powerful psychological act of self-soothing and simplification. By naming and locating the enemy, they transformed the impossible, transforming a terrifying, amorphous political struggle into a manageable moral witch hunt. The enemy gave the suffering a face and a singular cause. The figure of the traitor became a psychological container that held all the collective anxieties and failures. He was the sole reason the bread was expensive, the reason the revolutionary generals failed, and the reason the revolution's initial sublime promise was not yet fulfilled. By eliminating him, the citizens believed they would instantly solve all their complex abstract woes. This is the ultimate, desperate simplification strategy of the anxious, overloaded mind, allowing them to cling to the perfect ideal of the revolution itself. The obsession with the enemy within became a required form of hypervigilance, an exhausting, constant searching for signs of disloyalty, corruption, and sabotage in friends, neighbours, and even family. This intense scrutiny allowed the citizens to feel perpetually busy and morally essential, which acted as a powerful distraction from the terrifying reality that the revolution was spiralling fundamentally out of their rational control. The search for traitors was fundamentally a desperate form of psychological self-assurance. The final stage of desensitization was the tragic loss of individualized grief. When death becomes a mass statistic, the emotional weight of each loss is distributed and diluted into background noise. The collective mind struggled to process the sheer volume of trauma, choosing instead to suppress it entirely, leading to a shallow, detached observation of suffering that masked an internal, profound collapse of empathy and moral grounding, setting the stage for future collective action. The contagion of suspicion. The sustained period of the terror wasn't solely driven by official government decrees. It was overwhelmingly driven by the spontaneous self-reinforcing spread of fear, a classic example of a mass psychogenic illness. Fear, like any strong emotion, is deeply contagious, spreading rapidly through social networks and crowds. In a crowded public square or a tense political club, an individual's fear can rapidly be mirrored and amplified by those around them, becoming a collective, overwhelming experience. This creates a feedback loop where individual anxiety is instantly validated as objective truth. This created a debilitating, closed loop of anxiety that became self-sustaining. People acted suspiciously because they were afraid, and others immediately interpreted their fearful, cautious actions as concrete evidence of their suspicion. Trust became a high-risk commodity, almost an impossibility. To appear relaxed, disinterested, or simply neutral was to risk appearing uncommitted to the revolution, which was itself treated as irrefutable proof of treason. Therefore, everyone had to publicly perform their vigilance, exaggerating their commitment to the cause to ensure survival. The key element here is the fundamental breakdown of social trust. When you can no longer rely on your neighbour, your colleague, or even your spouse to act in good faith, your primary psychological task shifts entirely from cooperation and planning to basic survival. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every slight delay in affirming revolutionary loyalty became a piece of potentially damning, life-ending evidence that required immediate reporting. The sense of community was replaced by a network of nervous, self-policing observers. The gossip networks and citizen surveillance committees became the breeding ground for this contagion. These venues validated and amplified individual anxieties into collective, dangerous certainty. A simple rumour about bread hoarding in one neighbourhood could instantly transform into proof of a massive, coordinated royalist plot across the entire city. The collective mind was actively seeking the most dramatic and terrifying explanation for every event as a means of reducing its own internal ambiguity and affirming its initial paranoid diagnosis. This constant emotional mirroring and validation resulted in a terrifying feedback loop where the people were not merely passive victims of the terror, they were its active psychological engines. They willingly surrendered their critical faculties to the collective wave of fear, finding a perverse sense of safety and meaning in joining the hunters, desperately trying to prove their unwavering loyalty to the cause by pointing the finger at someone else. The September Massacres, moral disengagement. The September Massacres of 1792 represent a pivotal psychological break, the transition from political action to a state of psychological emergency and profound moral disengagement. Paris was under immediate threat from advancing Austrian and Prussian forces. The collective anxiety about imminent invasion, combined with the established paranoia about the enemy within, reached a point of absolute intolerable psychological pressure, demanding an immediate, decisive and internal purge. The fear was highly concretized. The prisoners in the city's jails, former priests, nobles and common criminals, would be released by internal royalist sympathisers to stab the revolution in the back while the National Guard was away fighting and dying on the frontier. The action taken was one of preemptive violence driven by absolute catastrophic desperation. It was a terrifying, simplified calculus. We must kill them now, or they will kill all of us later. This false choice offered a horrific solution to an unbearable moral problem. The executioners were not career criminals or soldiers. They were ordinary citizens, artisans, tradesmen and shopkeepers, driven by the psychological need to solve an intolerable situation instantly and decisively. This was a moment of profound moral disengagement, a psychological concept where the threat felt so immediate and existential that the normal rules of humanity, empathy and law were completely suspended and bypassed. The internal mandate of survival overrode all external ethical codes. For many participants, the act of execution was less about cruelty and more about a desperate act of restoring certainty. By eliminating the perceived internal threat, they genuinely believed they were making the outside world safe for the revolution to survive and thrive. The blood they shed was, in their desperate minds, a necessary sacred sacrifice made for the greater good of liberty, a destructive, flawed form of seeking moral meaning through elimination. The massacres provided a temporary violent catharsis. It confirmed the terrifying conviction that their survival depended entirely on ruthlessness, not restraint. The sheer scale and speed of the killings set a chilling, irreversible precedent that when the revolution felt existentially threatened, all limits on state-sanctioned violence were permanently removed. The emotional release achieved through violence guaranteed that violence would be the first tool reached for in every subsequent crisis, hardening the national heart. The scapegoat mechanism. Psychologists and anthropologists have long studied the scapegoat mechanism, a fundamental, ancient human response to collective crisis. When a group faces overwhelming guilt, confusion, or endemic economic failure, it is infinitely easier and psychologically less taxing to transfer all of that stress, confusion and blame onto an external disposable target than it is to address the underlying complex, intractable problems. The mechanism provides immediate psychological relief and self-absolution. In the revolution, this mechanism was put to brutal and efficient use. The non-juring priests, the returning émigrés, and later the politically active aristocratic women became the perfect vessels for collective blame. By intensely demonizing them, The revolutionaries could flawlessly maintain the belief that they themselves were morally pure and that the revolution itself was structurally and ideologically perfect. All fault resided externally in the scapegoat, keeping the collective conscience clean and the revolutionary ideals intact. The ritual of the public execution, with the crowds jeering and celebrating, acted as a powerful, temporary, emotional palliative. For that brief, horrifying moment, the collective anxiety, the gnawing feeling of failure was momentarily resolved. They had eliminated the visible source of the plague, and for a few hours they could breathe again. The relief was immediate, potent, and addictively reinforcing, ensuring the mechanism would be used again and again, demanding more victims to sustain the collective fiction of purity. This mechanism also provided a clear, easily understood moral narrative for the common citizen, offering relief from complexity. You didn't need to understand complex tax policy, the war on the Rhine, or the logistics of the bread supply. All you needed to know was that they, the accused, were the sole, concrete cause of your suffering, and we, the virtuous, were the necessary, simple solution. This rigid simplicity offered profound psychological comfort in a terrifying world of complexity. The act of blaming the scapegoat was therefore a desperate, flawed attempt to restore meaning to the revolution. The revolution meant something because it was fighting this specific, visible evil. The people weren't just participating in violence, they were performing a sacred, self-justifying act of moral purification to find and enforce order in the profound political and existential anarchy they had created, making the violence feel like a necessary act of national therapy. The power of binary thinking. The rise of the Jacobins and the terror was fueled by the collective mind's forceful embrace of binary thinking. In moments of high stress and existential threat, the human mind simplifies the world into two opposing camps: us versus them, good versus evil, pure versus traitor. This cognitive shortcut is a survival mechanism, sacrificing nuance for decisiveness and offering an immediate framework for action. This simplification provided immense psychological relief from the paralyzing anxiety caused by the revolution's complexity. If a problem is complex, why are we losing the war? Is federalism better than centralization? The answers require agonizing debate and compromise. If the problem is binary, is this man pure or is he a traitor? The answer is immediate and requires only ruthless action. The Jacobin dominance was built on offering this simple, decisive structure to the anxious masses. The consequence of this binary frame was the complete erasure of the political middle. Any person who tried to occupy a nuanced position, or who advocated for moderation or measured debate, was instantly categorized as not pure, which, in the binary logic of the terror, was functionally identical to being a traitor. This mechanism ruthlessly eliminated all moderates, making the political arena increasingly populated by only the most extreme and dogmatic thinkers, further polarizing the national mood. This allowed the revolutionary ideology to become increasingly rigid and unforgiving, creating a self-reinforcing echo chamber. Every action was justified, every excess excused, because it was done for the pure and against the traitor. There was no room for moral doubt, as moral doubt itself was framed as a sign of weakness and, thus, potential treason. The simplification was a psychological trap, designed to enforce compliance through the denial of internal moral conflict. For the individual citizen, adopting this binary worldview was a profound act of self-preservation. By publicly, loudly, and unequivocally embracing the pure side, they gained a temporary shield from suspicion. They traded their capacity for critical, complex thought for a rigid identity that offered safety and a terrifying, decisive sense of moral meaning. This cognitive framework made the terror possible and sustained its ruthless momentum by making psychological rigidity mandatory. Virtue as a defense mechanism. The Jacobean obsession with virtue was far more than a political slogan. It was a necessary collective psychological defence mechanism against the overwhelming guilt and terror they were generating. If you're systematically killing thousands of people, your mind must find a way to justify the horror to maintain its own stability and moral integrity. The concept of virtue provided that essential, self-soothing justification. It was the psychological lubricant that allowed the violence to continue. The collective belief system was structured around a simple, terrifying paradox. The more terrible the violence, the more profound the virtue of the cause must be, because only the purest, most sacred of ideals could necessitate such extreme, purifying sacrifice. This is a classic case of rationalization and moral inversion, twisting the moral compass to make the unthinkable necessary and noble. They use the abstract concept of virtue to sanctify the concrete, bloody violence of the terror. The violence itself became proof of the cause's righteousness. The revolutionaries desperately needed to believe that the Republic was fundamentally good and that their sacrifices were not in vain. The cognitive dissonance of being both a champion of liberty and a mass executioner was resolved by declaring the violence itself to be an ultimate necessary act of patriotism and morality. Terror was merely the prompt, severe and inflexible justice flowing logically from the uncompromising requirement of absolute virtue, as articulated by Robespierre. This ethical framework created an internal sense of psychological safety for the individual. By adhering strictly and publicly to the revolutionary morality, the individual felt protected from the very violence they were perpetrating and authorizing. They could not possibly be a traitor, because they were performing the very definition of virtue itself. It became a required identity performance for mental and physical survival, in a world of total uncertainty and arbitrary accusation. Ultimately, this psychological need for self-justification led to the establishment of an impossible, absolute standard of conduct. If everyone was required to be perfectly virtuous, then everyone was eventually destined to fall short. The defence mechanism of virtue thus became the very ruthless weapon that would eventually turn inward against its own creators, consuming them all when their own imperfections were inevitably exposed. The absolute anchor they sought was made of fatal glass. We pause here at the exact midpoint of our narrative, exactly at the point where the revolutionary dream begins its most tragic, self-destructive descent. The first 10 chapters trace the collective journey from the terror of the void, the paralysing loss of the king's anchor, to the desperate, violent search for a new absolute certainty in the form of collective virtue. We have established that the human mind, when existentially unmoored, frantically demands certainty, and the revolutionaries found it in the simple, destructive binary, pure traitor. As you listen and rest, allow your mind to reflect on this crucial pivot. Think about your own modern life. Where do you, or your community, seek absolute certainty when you feel anxious or overwhelmed by complex problems? The psychological engine of the terror was this simple, ancient trap. When the world is too complex, chaotic, or difficult to understand, we invent a single, concrete problem, an enemy, to explain all the chaos and absolve ourselves of responsibility. For the French, this allowed them to rationalize incredible suffering and violence. It gave them a terrible, destructive meaning for their pain. The choice to simplify their world into black and white was the moment they lost control, trading their liberty for the crushing rigidity of a new self-imposed dogma. This reflection segment is designed to transform the history you are absorbing into a quiet, stabilizing mental exercise. Do not hold the weight of these historical anxieties. Instead, observe them from a place of calm, detached analysis. The figures we will now study, Robespierre, Danton, and the ordinary citizen, were trapped in a psychological feedback loop that spiraled out of control. They used terror to seek temporary relief from their anxiety, but the act of terror only created more profound, pervasive fear. demanding more extreme violence to justify the initial smaller acts. It was a cycle of self-betrayal, a desperate spiral of moral rationalization that eventually left them completely exhausted and morally bankrupt. Now, as we prepare to move into the second half of this narrative, we will witness the terrifying institutionalization of that paranoia, the point where the system, initially designed to protect the revolution, begins to ruthlessly consume itself and its own creators. Chapters 11 through 20 describe the psychological unravelling, the descent from a high-minded ideology into pure self-defeating hysteria. The shift is profound. In the first half, the revolutionaries were building a new ideal world. In the second half, they are desperately trying to defend a flawed, terrifying structure by systematically eliminating anyone, including themselves, who exposes its fundamental cracks. This is the moment the machine of certainty becomes the ultimate enemy, revealing its true nature as a mechanism for self-destruction. Take a deep, centering breath here. Allow the stillness of this moment to settle over you. Focus only on the calm, detached observation. Let the historical detail wash over you, understanding that the chaos was not random or accidental, but the predictable, tragic result of the collective mind prioritizing simple, violent certainty over complex, empathetic truth. You're safe here, observing the anatomy of a tragic collective breakdown. We observe their collapse to understand and safeguard our own inner peace, and to reject the dangerous allure of absolute answers. Observe the immense psychological fatigue that sets in when a society lives under continuous, unyielding moral pressure. The final descent into hysteria is about to begin, marked by the blurring of lines between justice and murder, between self-defense and self-destruction. You're ready now to observe its patterns and absorb its crucial, quiet lessons from a place of quiet strength. We continue now with the man who embodied the terrible, unyielding certainty of the new state, Robespierre's certainty and isolation. Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, represents the perfect psychological vessel for the revolution's ideals and its eventual breakdown. His power was derived not from charisma or wealth, but from his absolute unyielding moral certainty. He genuinely believed himself to be the living, flawless embodiment of the general will, the pure, untainted voice of the virtuous people. This conviction created a psychological shield against all doubt, all empathy, and all critique, making him terrifyingly effective but profoundly detached. For Robespierre, the world was a high-stakes, black-and-white moral landscape. There was no moral ambiguity, only the pure, radiant light of revolutionary virtue and the absolute darkness of counter-revolutionary corruption. This binary, uncompromising world-view insulated him entirely from self-doubt. When ordinary men might agonize over the execution of a friend or ally, Robespierre saw only the surgical removal of an impurity necessary for the survival of the ideal republic, a clinical act of political necessity. His mind had completely depersonalized the victims into abstract obstacles to the ultimate goal. This level of inner certainty is a specific psychological phenomenon that allows individuals to commit extreme, destructive acts by reframing them as duties, not choices. The violence was not a choice he made, it was the inevitable, natural, surgical necessity of the revolution itself, flowing through him. He wasn't killing men, he was, in his mind, weeding the garden of the Republic, restoring its essential purity. This mental architecture made him terrifyingly effective, impervious to pleas for mercy, and increasingly isolated in his own moral universe. Robespierre's rhetoric focused incessantly on virtue, a moral quality he defined not just as personal goodness, but as rigid, uncompromising adherence to his political line. This created a profound sense of moral superiority in his immediate followers, the hardline Jacobins, allowing them to feel elevated above ordinary flawed humanity. They were the essential priests of a new political religion, protecting its fragile, perfect truth from the masses who were too weak to grasp it, reinforcing the sense that they were fighting a sacred cosmic battle. In the psychological vacuum left by the monarchy, Robespierre offered the most compelling and terrifying form of meaning available, a life dedicated to achieving a perfect, rational and virtuous state, no matter the human cost. His certainty became the rigid, destructive anchor the collective mind had desperately sought. However, his very perfection, his isolation from normal human compromise and frailty, is what ultimately made him vulnerable, as he set a standard no mortal could meet, including his followers. The tribunal's function as ritual. The Revolutionary Tribunal was established in 1793. Its function was less a court of law seeking justice, and more a public psychological ritual designed to manage and direct the immense collective anxiety of Paris. It was not primarily intended to determine guilt or innocence, those outcomes were often politically predetermined, but to visibly reaffirm the ideology in the minds of the witnesses, the jurors, and the larger Parisian populace, providing a theatrical release for collective tension. The trial became a dramatic public performance of moral cleansing. The audience, the jurors, and the accused all played defined, often scripted roles in a ritual that declared over and over, "Our republic is pure. This individual is the pollution, the impurity. By visibly removing them, the republic becomes whole and safe again." This performance provided a vital sense of control, order, and decisive action in a world defined by unpredictable, overwhelming chaos, making the chaos feel manageable. The ritualized nature of the proceedings, the rapid questioning, the intentional denial of witnesses and real legal counsel, the swift, often arbitrary pronouncement of the death sentence, served a crucial psychological purpose: to depersonalize the victim. The accused stopped being complex individuals with families and histories and instantly became abstract symbols of treason, corruption, or moral failure. This psychological distance allowed the participants to continue the violence without completely collapsing into guilt or moral confusion. By witnessing and participating in the ritual, the common citizen found their own meaning reaffirmed and their anxieties temporarily soothed. They were part of a just historic process, and the executions proved it. Every head that fell was a terrifying yet perversely comforting affirmation that their sacrifices and their fears were legitimate and were being decisively addressed by the strong hand of the state. It was a reassurance that someone finally was in control of the nation's destiny. The sheer formality of the tribunal, despite its deadly outcome, was a profound psychological necessity. It dressed up arbitrary, reactive, hysterical violence in the external clothes of reason, law, and bureaucratic due process, making the madness palatable and functional for the masses. Without this compelling, repetitive ritual, the Republic risked exposure to its own internal nihilistic chaos, which would have been unbearable to the collective mind, desensitization, and the numbing of empathy. One of the most chilling long-term psychological effects of the terror was the profound and rapid desensitization to death. Humans are hardwired by evolution to recoil from extreme violence and death, but the repeated ritualized spectacle of the public execution quickly broke down this natural essential defense. The guillotine's mechanical efficiency and relentless repetition transformed a horrific, singular act into a mundane, almost administrative daily event, like the ringing of a church bell. This process of numbing is a necessary, albeit tragic, psychological survival mechanism. When the threat of violence is constant and inescapable, the mind cannot remain in a state of high alarm without breaking down entirely. By psychologically minimizing the trauma, viewing the falling blade as an inevitable, predictable conclusion of political failure, the citizens could continue their daily lives without succumbing to paralyzing fear, debilitating empathy, or operational paralysis. The mind simply learned to filter out the horror as background noise. The execution site, the Place de la Révolution, became an extension of the marketplace, a place to gather, to exchange news, and to watch the show. This normalization of horror is the deep, dark psychological compromise required for a society to endure a constant state of internal political violence. Death was no longer a profound, sacred, singular event, but a clock ticking down the hours of the revolution, a backdrop to daily commerce and trivial chatter. Furthermore, participating in the crowd cheering for the victims provided a temporary active inoculation against becoming a victim yourself. This required act of public affirmation, of demonstrating one's full enthusiastic support and commitment to the terror, created a perverse, yet highly effective sense of psychological safety. The more enthusiastically you denounced the dead, the safer you felt in the terrifying presence of the living and the powerful, displacing your own fear onto others. The final stage of desensitization was the tragic loss of individualized grief. When death becomes a mass statistic, the emotional weight of each loss is distributed and diluted into background noise. The collective mind struggled to process the sheer volume of trauma, choosing instead to suppress it entirely, leading to a shallow, detached observation of suffering that masked an internal, profound collapse of empathy and moral grounding, setting the stage for future collective action. The cult of the Supreme Being and its failure. In the climax of The Terror, Robespierre attempted to solve the persistent psychological problem of the void once and for all by creating the cult of the Supreme Being. This was an elaborate effort to replace the fragmented, chaotic, and often atheistic revolutionary fervour with a single, ordered, rational, and state-sanctioned moral anchor that could finally bind the nation together under a unifying moral creed. He sought to replace the emotional effervescence with a controlled, intellectualized spiritual system. Psychologically, this was an implicit acknowledgement that the concept of pure abstract virtue, without a divine source, was not enough. The people desperately needed a ritual, a ceremony, and a visible, if deistic, higher power to give their constant sacrifices and terrors true, transcendent meaning. It was a decisive, desperate return to the psychological comfort of the absolute, but carefully stripped of the monarchy's corrupting earthly structure and priests. Robespierre was trying to manufacture a new spiritual centre by political fiat. The magnificent festival of the Supreme Being was intended to be a moment of massive, collective catharsis and ideological resolution. Robespierre, descending theatrically from a massive papier-mâché mountain, was meant to embody the Republic's flawless morality and serve as its high priest. It was a desperate attempt to manufacture and restore the collective effervescence felt at the start of the revolution, forcing an emotional high by political decree, complete with elaborate symbolism. The failure of the cult was instantaneous and absolute, a critical turning point. The people, battered into cynicism by months of pervasive paranoia and mass death, no longer possessed the capacity for genuine, uncritical enthusiasm. They saw the attempt at control, the blatant theatrical positioning of Robespierre, and the new ritual felt artificial, rigid, and ultimately terrifyingly controlling. It lacked the genuine, spontaneous passion of 1790, and instead felt like a cold political stunt. This psychological moment confirmed that the revolution had consumed its own idealistic soul. The attempt to force meaning through a new synthetic religion only exposed the depth of the spiritual vacuum and the extent of Robespierre's singular, frightening power. The people did not embrace the new deity. They feared its self-appointed prophet, paving the way for his swift and brutal downfall a few weeks later, when his control became too psychologically demanding to bear. The fissure of doubt and Danton. The psychological fracturing of the ruling elite began when the impossible, unrelenting need for virtue clashed directly with the fundamental human need for rest. Georges Danton, a passionate revolutionary but a man deeply connected to the earthy sensual reality of life, became the voice of the collective weariness. arguing that the time for terror was over, and that psychological and political stability must be restored. He represented the urge for normalcy. Danton represented the human urge for normalcy, for compassion, for a return to pleasure, humour, and simple existence. His call for indulgence was a direct, existential, psychological threat to Robespierre's absolute doctrine of virtue. Robespierre understood that to allow the nation to relax was to instantly invite the return of individual doubt, complexity, moral nuance, and ultimately, the total loss of his carefully constructed, rigid moral system. Relaxation meant the end of the terror's necessity. The ensuing confrontation was a psychological war of ideals. Danton sought to relieve the crushing, paralysing national anxiety by restoring confidence. Robespierre insisted that the anxiety and constant tension were necessary to achieve the perfect, ultimate republic. By executing Danton and his followers, Robespierre was not just silencing a political opponent, he was surgically executing the last voice of moral compromise, human frailty, and emotional release within the government itself. This act created a profound, chilling realization among the remaining members of the government. No one was safe. If a revolutionary hero like Danton, who had led the initial uprising, who was the face of the people, could be declared a traitor and eliminated for suggesting mercy, then the standards of virtue had become impossible to meet for anyone. The purity test was infinite, and everyone was failing, confirming the absolute paranoia. The execution of Danton marked the moment the terror became completely unmoored from rational or political justification. It was no longer a tool against external enemies, but a self-sustaining tool of psychological paranoia, turning relentlessly inward, consuming its own, and confirming the utter, comprehensive collapse of social trust even at the very highest echelons of power. The terror was now less about securing the Republic and more about enforcing Robespierre's personal, unyielding moral supremacy. The Law of 22, Prairial Hysteria, institutionalized. The Law of 22 Prairial, passed in June 1794, was the ultimate bureaucratic institutionalization of collective hysteria and fear. It fundamentally stripped the accused of any meaningful legal defense. It eliminated witnesses, denied legal counsel, and left only two possible verdicts for the tribunal: acquittal or death. This law was explicitly a mechanism for speed, designed to remove every last bit of psychological friction from the process of state-sanctioned killing and maximize efficiency. Psychologically, this law eliminated the last vestiges of the tribunal's ritual as a court of law, transforming it entirely into a high-speed factory for death. By removing the need for evidence, testimony, or even logic, the process affirmed the collective paranoia. Merely being accused, merely being suspected of disloyalty, was sufficient and necessary proof of guilt, simplifying the problem entirely. Guilt was now a state of being, not an act committed. This was the point where the need to simplify a complex, chaotic reality reached its destructive climax. The law essentially declared that every citizen was guilty until proven innocent by their unwavering public adherence to an impossible moral standard. The anxiety of agency was no longer just an internal struggle. It became a literal codified death sentence, inescapable and instantaneous, placing the burden of impossible proof on every single individual. The Great Terror, the intense period following this law, was characterized by an explosion of executions, the fournées, batches of victims. The sheer, overwhelming volume of death was a final, desperate attempt to achieve ultimate clarity and decisive meaning through mass elimination. If they killed enough of the impure, surely the Republic would finally manifest its perfect, virtuous and peaceful form, resolving the enduring cognitive dissonance. But the opposite happened. The extreme escalation did not bring relief, but profound collective exhaustion and terror. The terror became psychologically unbearable even for the very men enforcing it. They began to realize the machine they had perfected was now so automated and so powerful that it was fully capable of consuming them, leading directly to the final, necessary psychological break where self-preservation overcame ideology and fear turned on its creator. The psychology of the panicked crowd. In the final weeks of Robespierre's rule, the pervasive anxiety that had defined the revolution morphed into true, destabilizing hysteria. The rate of executions was so high that Paris was gripped by an intense psychological fever. The line between being the hunter and the hunted blurred completely, causing everyone to suspect everyone else, often without logic, motive, or even a clear target. The city was one vast collective nervous breakdown. The collective mind was running a high fever, desperately trying to purge the virus of doubt through increasingly violent action. The logic became circular, divorced from reality. The terror must continue because we are still suffering. We are still suffering because there are still traitors we haven't found. Therefore, we must kill more to end the suffering. The cycle became self-feeding. The killings were feeding the paranoia they were originally meant to cure, creating an ever-escalating spiral. The psychological pressure created bizarre and frantic public manifestations. People would nervously avoid eye contact, speak only in rigid revolutionary slogans, and perform increasingly excessive acts of public virtue to try and deflect suspicion from themselves. This constant, exhausting performance of loyalty led to profound psychological fatigue, emotional burnout, and a complete breakdown of genuine social connection among the entire populace. Trust was extinct. It was during this time that the ultimate collapse of meaning occurred. The execution of entire groups, like the workers of the Paris sections or the ordinary citizens who had been the backbone of the revolution, meant that the terror was now devouring the very people it claimed to protect. The ideal of virtue had collapsed entirely, revealing the nihilistic, empty void beneath the structure they had built, stripping the violence of any remaining moral justification. This final stage of hysteria was characterized by a deep, numbing sense of inevitability and powerlessness. The citizens no longer hoped for an end to the terror, but simply waited for their own turn to arrive, having lost the capacity for critical thought or collective resistance. The extreme fear had paralyzed them until the threat became utterly immediate and personal to the leaders themselves, finally triggering the necessary terminal break. Thermidor. The psychological breaking point. The fall of Robespierre on the 9th of Thermidor was not a planned coup based on high-minded ideology, but a spontaneous psychological revolt born of collective immediate fear. The men who finally denounced him did so not out of political conviction, but because they knew, with absolute terrifying certainty, that they were the next names on his constantly expanding list. It was a primal, desperate act of self-preservation that broke the fever, overriding all political loyalty. The moment he was silenced and overthrown, the dark, intense wave of collective effervescence that had supported the terror instantly evaporated across Paris, replaced by an overwhelming, giddy, almost manic relief. The crowd did not cheer for a new political regime, but for the fundamental end of the unbearable psychological pressure. They were celebrating the death of the relentless certainty that had demanded their moral and physical compliance every waking hour. The silence of the guillotine was the greatest liberty. The execution of Robespierre was a profound psychological ritual that finally resolved the nation's internal conflict. By killing the one man who embodied the impossible, absolute standard of virtue, the nation symbolically killed the standard itself, granting themselves collective permission to stop the violence. The cycle of terror was broken by the sheer psychological exhaustion and terror of its own practitioners, who realized the ultimate threat was the system they had created. This moment underscores a crucial psychological truth. Absolute certainty is fundamentally unsustainable in human politics. The collective mind, after reaching a state of extreme rigidity, tension, and terror, will eventually violently reject that structure simply to survive. The fundamental human needs for rest, emotional release, and complexity ultimately overrode the destructive need for absolute simple meaning, proving human nature more resilient than ideology. The following period, the Thermidorian reaction, was marked by a rapid, almost manic rush back to pleasure, luxury fashion, and social life. A frantic, desperate attempt to suppress the trauma of the preceding year and return to the simple, forgotten joys of ordinary existence. The revolution had failed to provide the perfect anchor, and the people were left with the difficult, necessary task of navigating a messy, uncertain, yet livable reality. The legacy of national trauma, the deep psychological wounds inflicted during the Great Terror, did not simply heal with Robespierre's death. They became an enduring, unspoken national trauma that shaped French politics for generations. The generation that lived through it was left with a profound distrust of all forms of idealism, collective political movements, and all claims of absolute moral purity, leading to a long period of pervasive political cynicism and retreat from public life. Psychologically, the survivors faced the immense, ongoing burden of moral memory. How do you live with the fact that you may have cheered the deaths of the innocent, or at least stood silently by while the terror raged? This unresolved guilt, shame, and cognitive dissonance contributed to a deep, collective suppression of the memories of the terror, making it incredibly difficult for the nation to process its own historical role in the violence, leading to a profound cultural silence. This silent legacy is the long-term cost of seeking meaning through violence and ideological simplification. When the ultimate goal, the perfect, virtuous republic, fails to materialize, all that remains is the horrific, undeniable evidence of the brutal means used to achieve it. The meaning they sacrificed everything for proved illusory and unreachable, leaving behind only emptiness, profound trauma, and deep regret, a national reckoning with futility. The revolution ultimately taught the nation a brutal and necessary truth. The relentless pursuit of absolute clarity and simplicity often leads to the darkest forms of self-deception and collective cruelty. The psychological demand for a perfect, simple world had resulted in the most complex, destructive, and bloody period of their history. The lesson burned deep. The resilience of a society lies not in its rigidity, but in its ability to embrace the messiness of humanity. In the quiet decades that followed, the search for meaning slowly shifted away from the public square, no longer sought in the ecstatic unity of a crowd or the absolute dictates of a leader. Meaning was slowly and painfully reclaimed in the individual conscience, in the quiet acts of rebuilding genuine social trust, and in the hesitant, difficult acceptance of a flawed, uncertain yet livable future. The psychology of the void reconciled. The narrative of the French Revolution closes by bringing us back full circle to the psychological void that started it all. The monarchy had provided a rigid, albeit unjust, sense of meaning and order. The revolution shattered that, creating a vacuum that was frantically filled by hysterical, ephemeral, and ultimately self-destructive absolutes, unity, virtue, and terror. This cycle of seeking and failing to find a perfect external anchor defined the decade. In the end, the new certainty proved far more terrifying and unstable than the old tyranny. The nation learned a brutal, visceral truth. The search for a simple, total answer to life's inherent chaos is a dangerous psychological pursuit. True, enduring stability is not found in the rigidity of an absolute ideal, but in the resilient strength of accepting complexity, moral ambiguity, and human imperfection. The acceptance of the messy middle is the ultimate peace. The final psychological lesson is that the paralyzing anxiety of agency must be faced, not perpetually displaced. When you are confronted with overwhelming chaos or complexity, the mind's natural anxious defense is to invent a simple, single enemy, or an absolute rule. But true peace requires embracing the difficult, uncertain work of incremental progress, continuous negotiation, and moral compromise, understanding that the only true security is internal. The voices of the French Revolution fade now, their frantic search for a new moral anchor, a cautionary echo across the centuries. Their madness was the human mind's desperate response to an existential void, a terrible, necessary reminder that while we naturally crave simplicity, we must always choose the difficulty of empathy and nuance over the devastating, bloody ease of absolute certainty and total control. Let the final image of that restless search for meaning guide your mind to rest. They sought clarity in blood. We seek clarity in quiet observation and acceptance. The chaos of history recedes, leaving behind the comforting, steady drumbeat of your own quiet consciousness, anchored not by external decrees, but by inner resilience. Rest in the knowledge that your mind is capable of handling the messy, beautiful reality of the world without needing to simplify it. Finding stability in ambiguity. As the echoes of the Parisian crowds and the fall of the guillotine fade into the past, the historical noise gives way to a profound, restful stillness. The French sought a perfect, rigid structure, a total, unwavering moral guide, but they only found genuine, lasting relief when they finally accepted the imperfect, messy nature of human reality and compromise. Carry this essential historical lesson inward now. You do not need absolute certainty to be safe. Imagine your stream of nightly thoughts, the worries, the plans, the lingering dialogues, not as a rigid revolutionary decree that must be obeyed, but as the quiet flow of the Seine River we saw in our final image. They are constant, moving, and sometimes turbulent, but they are not the riverbank, and they are not you. They are simply water passing through the vast, open space of your tranquil awareness. Let go of the need to find a single, simple, immediate answer to the overwhelming complexities in your life. Remember how the collective mind of the revolution invented the traitor or the simple problem to explain away the profound stress. Acknowledge that complexity is natural, that ambiguity is the constant state of being, and in that compassionate acknowledgement, find immediate deep relief. You're allowed to rest even in uncertainty. Picture yourself now standing on a quiet, solid bank of that river. The air is cool, still, and carries only the scent of wet earth. You're watching the reflection of the pale, distant moonlight on the water. This moonlight is your consciousness. It is steady, unmoving, and fundamentally peaceful, regardless of the momentary surface ripples and reflections on the water's surface. Your core is untouchable. Now, breathe deeply. As you inhale slowly, draw in the knowledge that you are whole, resilient, and fundamentally secure, regardless of external chaos. As you exhale fully, release any lingering, anxious demand for simple answers or perfect control. Let go of the need to be the hunter of anxiety, and instead become the quiet observer of peace, watching the river flow by without judgment. Allow the soothing distance of history to cloak you. The chaotic energy of the revolution is now a fixed, observable pattern. You're not required to participate in its madness. You're only required to observe its quiet lesson, that peace resides not in solving the puzzle of the world, but in accepting its magnificent, messy, unsolvable whole. Sink deeper into the surface you're resting on, feeling the gravity holding you securely. The collective fever of the French Revolution was rooted in the fear of the void, but there is no void in you. You're filled with a quiet, resilient strength that allows you to tolerate the necessary, beautiful ambiguity of being human. Rest now in that quiet strength. If these tales of history's collective psychological journeys have calmed your mind and offered a new perspective on your own anxieties, Join us for more journeys into the quiet past. Every epoch holds a lesson about the human condition, a story of turmoil and the ultimate search for peace. Subscribe to The Psychological Historian and let these immersive narratives guide your nights to deep, restful sleep. We continue our exploration, understanding that the weight of history is best absorbed in stillness. The pursuit of meaning is not a loud, frantic clamour, but a quiet, patient observation. As the great revolutionary fervour finally settles into stillness, allow your own internal noise to settle too. The difficult truths of history often make the best lullabies, grounding us in the enduring nature of the human spirit. Join our community of quiet observers and find your own anchor. History's great collective souls, from the ecstatic crowds of the Fete to the silent observers of Thermidor, sought meaning through chaos, ultimately guiding us to a profound psychological truth. Their fervent search for absolute certainty ultimately delivered the painful lesson that true peace resides in embracing the uncertain, the complex, and the deeply human. As their stories fade now, let your thoughts rest, carried into deep, restful dreams. The history of chaos has shown you the quiet path to your own inner order, grounded in the acceptance of life's necessary, natural ambiguity.